I'm way more filled up by doing ministry, and it's way more, it's like when you see like who God made you to be aligned with what you're doing, and that like perfect intersection. That's kind of what I feel like kids ministry is.
Right.
So it's a cool place to be.
So I don't think it surprised anybody who knew me. When I was a middle schooler, it was at a camp between 7th and 8th grade year. I had just kind of this nagging idea that this was something I was supposed to do. Welcome to First Families, conversations to encourage you in your family's spiritual journey. Well, hey everybody, welcome to First Families,
where we put families first.
It's a great day. Hey, it's January, the time where we put the old year behind and look forward to a new year. And what a great time for us to think about the new year. Do you have New Year's resolutions? What's your word for the year?
You know, I'm not one to really do that, or if I come up with a word, I forget it promptly. So I have aspirations, like it would be nice if, but I don't really hold myself to the goals because I don't want to fail at keeping them. So I set myself in standards pretty low. I usually set a book reading goal.
Oh yeah, that's good.
So like I have an app that tracks the number of books I read, not including picture books for the child, but just like my personal books that I read. Yeah. And so I failed at meeting my goal this past year by about 4 books. So I'm going to have to lower my goal this year so I can have success. But that's kind of my main goal.
Did you do like a last minute push in December?
Yeah, so yes, kind of, but not really, because my free time to read is very limited at the moment. Right. And so I can't just like read for 6 hours on Christmas Day because I have a child that I would much rather play with and engage with than sit in the corner and read and ignore them. Yeah. So I have my priorities straight, I think. Right. But it has negatively impacted my reading score.
Right. In December, I finished. There was one book that I was reading that was like 1,200 pages, and so I had been reading that for months. I had to recheck it out from the library multiple times. But I was able, like, I've finished, I think, 4 books in December, and so I don't remember what my reading goal. Every January 1st, the Parkers sit around the table and we pull out our Barnabas book. I've mentioned Barnabas book before, and we all say the things that we want to do. They're not really New Year's resolutions, I guess. They're just things that we want to do. We're not
aspirations for the year.
Aspirations for the year. That's right. And so I'll say, like, I want to average, 10 miles a week running, or I want to read 10 books. This year, that aren't like ministry related, like fiction classic books, or I'll say stuff like that. The kids will come up with their own, and Misha does hers. But I've forgotten what my goal was from last year. This January 1st, we'll have to look back at that and take a look at it. So
so my favorite hack for the reading goal is when the new year starts, any books that I didn't finish in December, like I'm really close to finishing like 3 books but I'm going to finish like the first week of the new year, and they will count for my new year reading goal. And so I usually like hit the ground running and like complete all these books in January. And it makes me feel better about myself. I love it.
So. That's so great. Well, January is also a great time to kind of evaluate where you are in your career and as a person and all of that stuff. And so one of the things we're doing in our ministries is helping our students and kids get a grasp of the gospel, right, and where they stand in the gospel, and come to a deeper understanding of what God has done for us. And so it's just a beautiful moment for us to stop and reevaluate kind of what it is that defines us as people in relationship with God. And I love January. I love new starts. I love it's like that metaphor of the Etch-a-Sketch, where you draw your picture and then you mess up, and then you can shake it and start over again. And I love that image. And so January is a great time to really lean into that. So
that's pretty cool.
So one thing that we haven't talked about yet is why we do what we do. So here's a question that was posed to me by an experienced pastor. I was young, I was in college, and I had no idea what pastoral ministry meant. And so he was talking me through some of the stuff. He was kind of a mentor to me, and he said, Matt, can you imagine yourself doing anything else in the world and being happy? So let's answer that question. How about that? Okay.
Yes.
So what do you think? Can you imagine yourself being happy doing anything else in the world?
Not really. Like I can, on my worst days, I can imagine myself doing other things, and they seem kind of potentially nice for various reasons. But at the end of the day, I always come back to no. I love this. I love ministry. I love kids ministry. There are probably variations of my current job that are kind of under that umbrella that I'd be happy doing. But in general, going from like wanting to be a missionary or a nurse or a teacher, like I wouldn't like to do any of those, as important as they are. I think I am way more filled up by doing ministry, and it's way more, it's like when you see like who God made you to be aligned with what you're doing, and that like perfect intersection. That's kind of what I feel like kids ministry is.
Right.
So it's a cool place to be.
That is very cool. Every now and then I'll be doing something related to, I'll be teaching about ancient empires and how they relate to the Old Testament, or I'll be driving long distance on the way to camp, or I'll be leading games, and I'll think, this would be okay. If this whole ministry thing doesn't work out, I could be a history teacher. Maybe I'd have to get a lot more education and pass the praxis, which would probably be an issue in itself. I could be a long haul truck driver. My dad did that. My uncle did that. I come from a long line of long haul truck drivers. Or I could be, do recreation or camps, or some kind of thing like that. In college, I probably could have minored in PE because I took so many electives in racquetball and golf. I wasted a lot of time in college, and I'm not proud of that, but I do think it's funny. But yeah, so I think I probably could achieve some level of happiness. But there's this thing about ministry, and like you said, your giftedness and what God made you to do, and the things you enjoy doing, kind of coming together like that. Yeah. I think that's great. Do you think that thinking about your calling as a minister, and saying I'm called to do this specific thing, like I'm called to children's ministry, do you think that's like an over spiritualization of it? Do you think that we can do that? Like we can say, overemphasize the God's called me to do this, or do you think that maybe we want to make our job more important by saying it's a
that's an
divine
interesting
thing?
question. I think you can over spiritualize it, and more importantly, I think you can put too much pressure on it. Because I saw at Washita a lot of people who put too much pressure on figuring out what they were called to do, instead of just like following God's lead and doing like what they felt gifted to do and what they wanted to do, like within wisdom and reason, and then seeing where that led them. They were so stressed about making sure they were doing what God was calling to be. It just like took the joy out of it, and also just kind of I think over spiritualized it in a way that isn't healthy.
Right.
I think, kind of going back to your first question on like, can you imagine doing anything else? Like looking back on my journey, I don't think I could have landed anywhere else but here, which to me shows God's fingerprints all over my journey, which to me says he called me to it.
Right.
And so there is a lot of elements of truth on that. And then, So
you feel like there's an element of calling, but also an element of wisdom and knowing yourself that is like, when those things come together, then that's like, this is where I'm supposed to be, kind of idea.
In spiritual formation in college, Dr. Scott Duvall talked about how God, like, what is God's will for my life? And he basically said God's will is generally more like a path than it is a line. So a view of God's will as a line would be that there is a set like journey that you have to follow to be in God's will. And if you mess up and you go work at QT instead of Chick-fil-A, you are now outside of God's will. And you know what, maybe depending on what God's told you to do, that might be outside of God's will, but it's this very like linear, almost fear-based, I'm going to mess up and not be in God's will anymore. But really it's more like a path. And there's some things that are definitely outside of God's will that you shouldn't do. But then there are some things that sometimes God gives us a choice. And he lets us make those decisions on our own, and he leads us and guides us and shapes our life from that. And that's a very middle ground, non-Calvinist view of God's will in your life. But I think it's super important because there have been very clear times in my life where God made it very evident that this was my next move. And then there were times where I kind of got to choose, and he worked all things. Like, God does not tell me what I should eat for lunch every day. There are some things that are definitely maybe outside of God's will for what I should eat for lunch, but I get free choice in that.
I feel like I'm looking pretty good today, so I think that God may have told me to put on this sweater and this shirt.
Yeah, not that.
There's actually a book about this called Decision Making and the Will of God. I've got it on my shelf here somewhere. But he actually talks about the very steps that you take. Some people are like, these are God-ordained steps, like literal steps. I took the step on the ground in that moment because God ordained that thing to happen. I put on this sweater and this shirt because this was something God ordained, because he had a purpose for that. And I think that might be taking that a step too far. That's right. What is the story that brought you into children's ministry? Why do you do children's ministry? What is your story about why you do what you do?
I will try to keep this short. So it starts way back in high school. I kind of growing up, I wanted to be a missionary, a nurse, or a teacher. Those were my three things that I kind of floated between. Except in fourth grade, I wanted to be a scientist, but turns out I hate science. So nurse.
You had specific influences that
yes.
kind of, yeah.
Yes. So my mom's a nurse, and so that makes extra good sense that I wanted to be a nurse like my mom. Right. My aunt was a missionary in Ecuador, and so I always grew up with overseas missions being like a legit thing real people do. It wasn't just this like for other people thing. And so I liked the idea of doing missions. And then teacher, I loved school. Like my favorite game to play in second grade was school. So I would pretend to be at school at home. So teacher makes sense too. And so I'm a big music person. I did a lot of choir and orchestra in high school. And so when it came time to choose a degree, I was like, well, I like music. I like kids. I'd love to be a music teacher. That sounds like fun. And so I chose my college based off of doing a music degree. So that's how I ended up at Ouachita for their music program. But in the meantime, my senior year of high school, I got the chance to go to CentriKid camps with my church. So they went and they needed an extra girl leader to go for the summer. In the 12 years my children's minister had been doing it, she'd never had an issue getting a girl volunteer because normally moms want to go. So you have more than you need. And so it was one of those, I think God ordained moments. It was the only week in the entire summer I was actually free because I had a lot of things lined up for after graduation. And she needed someone. And so I was like, I'll do it. And so when I went to camp, I got to do this program called the Team Assistant Program where I got to go as an adult leader, but I also got to see what it was like to be a staffer. And that was a moment where I felt like God was calling me to do something in children, or no, not do something. He hadn't gotten that far yet. I felt like God was calling me to be a CentriKid staffer. Like it was an idea I could not shake, and I was stressing about it for no reason. I was like, I don't want to apply and lock up my summer before I've even gotten to college and see what the options are. And it was one of this over spiritualized moment that also showed me God was calling, because it was relentless all week. And so I was like, fine, I'll apply. So that's how I became a CentriKid staffer. And I did that for 2 summers and fell in love with kids ministry, and the intentionality behind it and how we can teach kids about God and the Bible through all sorts of fun ways, Bible study, rec, cooking, all the different tracks. And so that was my first kind of introduction to kids ministry outside of what I experienced growing up. But I was still doing music ed. Still want to be a music teacher. And then God shut a door in CentriKid my 3rd summer, and so I ended up doing an internship at a church in Houston, Tallowood. And when I emailed them, I emailed the children's minister and the music person because I was looking for either a music or a children's ministry internship. Music had already been filled up, so I was stuck. Not actually stuck, but I ended up with the children's ministry internship, and that summer was kind of that intersection of who God has made me to be with what I love to do. And I realized that was children's ministry. And so God shifted my desires away from music into children's ministry and kind of confirmed my calling. And so then I went and got my master's in children's ministry and then landed in Lee Summit, Missouri for children's ministry.
And this is your first full-time position?
This is my first full-time position. I had served in churches my senior year. Once I was like, okay, I need to do children's ministry, I went back to college my senior year at Ouachita and started teaching 2nd and 3rd grade Sunday school at Second Baptist Arkadelphia, where you were the student minister, actually. That's right. We didn't interact at all.
Barely,
but Miles was a grade above. Miles was in 4th grade when I was teaching 3rd grade, so I knew y'all from music ed from Misha.
Yeah.
So I did that and then went to grad school, and I served at a church and got some preschool experience. But yeah, this was my first full-time gig all the way up in Lee Summit, Missouri.
Where you had never been before.
I'd never been. That was another God-guided moment. I was applying for jobs, and this one just really fit really well. And I think that was one of those moments I could have had a choice, but this felt the most comfortable. There were other jobs I was interviewing with, and they were fine jobs, but I chose to say yes to Lee Summit. God did not close other doors. And so I would say that was...
interesting.
I chose to stop the job process on some other churches when I liked it here. And so I feel like if I'd said no here, I would have landed at another church and it would have worked out fine. But I love the church and I love the way my life is now. So I'm happy I chose this.
Yeah. I was a lot less thoughtful about my journey into ministry. I was a church kid growing up. I was a Awana kid. I was winning. Like, I would do it and get all the awards in Awana, and I remember so many passages from my grown up years, specifically because of my time in Awana, but also because my parents were like church people. Like, we went to a super small church in Jacksonville, Arkansas, and so my parents were there constantly, and I was there as a middle schooler, mowing the lawn on Saturday, there on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, like visitation on Tuesday nights. My mom would go knock on doors on Saturday morning, and I was there with her, and then we'd go take care of the church grounds on Saturday afternoon. I mean, we were
church people.
Church people. So I don't think it surprised anybody who knew me. When I was a middle schooler, it was at a camp between 7th and 8th grade year. I had just kind of this nagging idea that this was something I was supposed to do. But somebody said, you know what, you've got time. No need to really lean in that too much. I think it was terrible advice. Just forget about it for now and see what happens later on. And it was that point where I decided to just kind of go off the deep end. And so I started chasing after a whole bunch of other things. And it wasn't until senior year in high school that kind of came back around. I was trying to decide what the heck I want to do with my life. And I found out my parents are moving away. And so I decided to go to Ouachita Baptist University to stay in Arkansas, basically. I had no idea what Ouachita Baptist University was about. I had some teachers who kind of went there, but I didn't really know anything about it. I'd been to a basketball camp there, didn't know anything about it. But my good friend in high school was going to Ouachita Baptist University. I had decided, basically because I thought people would think that was a good thing for me to do, to go into ministry. Had no idea what that was about. I had no idea what it meant to be a pastor, or I knew a bunch of verses, but I had not thought deeply in theological terms. And so my years at Ouachita, I wasted a lot of time, like I said, doing PE stuff and taking all kinds of crazy electives. But somewhere along the line, something shifted, and it was between my junior year and my senior year. I'd wasted so much time in my college years. I was entering my first senior semester with a 1.875 GPA. I'd failed all kinds of classes. I was not taking anything seriously. I was not a deep thinker about theological things. And I just kind of relayed on pat, Christianese answers, and my professors were having nothing of it. But there was a guy on campus one day who was recruiting for a camp. It's crazy how camp ministry plays into our stories.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And I was like, oh, I'll go see what it's about. And that guy because my life was a wreck at that time. I'll tell you more about it at another time. But he made the worst staffing decision he ever made and hired me to do recreation at this camp in Arkansas. And that moment was the beginning of the turning point in my life. Like, that camp, I was one person going into camp, and I was a completely different person that fall semester. When I met my wife, and my grades took a huge bump. I took things seriously. I listened in theology classes and really started thinking deeply about it. So then I still had no idea what it meant to be a pastor. And in seminary, I had a professor. I was going full on pastorship because I came from a small church, and that was the only staff member we had. And so if I was going to be a pastor, I thought, well, might as well be senior pastor. And I had a professor in seminary who was like, I don't think you're a senior pastor. You don't seem to have quite the thing for that kind of leadership. And I don't know if that was an insult or not, but. But after a conversation with him, he helped me remember that I wanted to be in ministry because of a guy named Wes Hamilton, who was the youth pastor at my friend's church in high school where we didn't have a student ministry in our church because we were too small. So I went to that church for youth group activities and stuff like that. And so Wes Hamilton, every time I walked in the door, he looked at me, his face lit up with a big smile and says, "Hey, I'm so glad you're here." He had red hair. I had red hair. He was goofy and crazy and a bit of a nerd. And, that's kind of where I was, even though I was trying to be an athlete, a cool guy, even though I wasn't. And I remembered that person made me feel accepted and loved no matter what. And it opened this conversation with my professor, opened my mind and heart to this thought that I could be that for the dork, nerdy, ostracized, doesn't know who they are or what they want to do with their lives. I could be that person who, when they walk in the door, my face lights up and they can feel accepted and welcomed and loved. And that became my passion, and it remains my passion to this day. And so in a church context, why I do what I do, I want to make that person who feels like they don't belong or fit anywhere. I want to make them feel that they belong in their church family. So,
well, I think what's really cool about your story and mine is we both ended up in Silver Place taking very different routes. Yeah. But we both had a moment where God kind of crystallized what you could call our calling.
Yeah.
Where we were doing different things, God was leading and guiding us, but we can both point to a light bulb moment per se. And I think that's why I can say comfortably that I'm called to ministry. That it wasn't just like, well, I chose this, but I can, in my faith, in my spiritual journey, I can point back and be like, this is the moment, this is the time in my life where it crystallized that I didn't want to do anything else, that this was what God called me to do. And I think sometimes people get calling confused in the sense of they think, well, I love Jesus, so I must be called to ministry. When in reality, you can love Jesus in all fields. And all of your fields can be a ministry of sorts. And that's different than being called to full-time vocational ministry. Because if we didn't have those crystallized moments, I'm sure both of us would not be in ministry anymore. Because there's always a point where you have to lean on your calling and remember that this is where God's placed you.
Okay, now having done this for 25 years, more than 25 years, I know why the guy said, do anything else if you think you can do it and be happy at it. Because there are moments where this work is heartbreaking and hard, and like it seems like everybody is against you sometimes. People ask questions like, "What do you do all day?" kind of, and not mean it in a
condescending way.
Well, they do mean it.
They do mean it in a condescending way. Okay.
Yeah. Not in a what's the word when you're asking questions and
curious.
Not in a curious way, but in a condemnation.
Like, why are you here?
Way.
Why are you doing this?
Why are we paying you to do this? Yeah.
You're wasting my tithe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's not a pleasant place to be. But so if we didn't feel called to it, we would have left a long time ago. But all right, so this is a great transition. What are you good enough at to do? Like, if this whole ministry thing doesn't work out, what could you do?
Okay, so I have several. Do we have time for several?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the first one, if I had known this existed, I would have really loved being a child life specialist. I didn't know that was a thing. It's the people in the hospital who help kids on the non-medical side of coping with trauma and with all the different surgeries they're going through, like all the different things that kids need help with when they're in the hospital. That's not the RN doctor side. I think I would thrive in that pretty well, but there's only like 2 per children's hospital in the U.S., so it's an incredibly difficult field. I could go back and be a music teacher. I have that degree. I have the expired license. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. You
Elementary.
passed the praxis.
I passed the praxis. I would not do well in high school. I'd have to do elementary school. I don't think it would bring me as much joy. But I could do it. And then I jokingly, when we were editing the Advent Devos, I said I should be a copy editor. Because I am detail oriented. So I do find some joy in creating order and fixing things. The problem is I never learned grammar, so I would literally be a terrible copy editor because I just go off of the feel of language, not what's actually correct. So if you find any typos or incorrect grammar things in the Advent Devos, that's my fault. Well, actually, it's really my teacher's fault from elementary school for never teaching me grammar. So, all of those different, they're kind of ministry adjacent people-y Except for copy editing. That's when I don't want to interact with anyone and hide in my office. So, yeah.
Well, I would like to think that I could do like something in education, but when I think about what I would do, like would I do history? I like the story of history, but the details are not my thing. Like, 700-ish BCE,
Give or take 200 years.
Yeah, and so since I'm that way, I have a hard time holding a kid's feet to the fire in an exam or something like that. Oh, you got it within a couple of years, no problem. So my evaluations and exams would be a mess if I did that. So I don't guess I would be any good at that. I could do fast food. I worked at Sonic for a while. My brother's in Sonic drive-in field, and so I could probably do.
There's like a certain thrill. I've never worked in fast food, but I always worked at the concession stands, and
yes.
I loved it. Like I love doing orders and
fun.
Money and cash. Like I could find some joy in that.
Yeah, but like in management and fast food is tough. Like
I do well with
it's a hard place to be.
Mm-hmm.
Full time. So I think it'd probably eat me alive. I'd probably be a shell of myself if I actually did that. I'm worthless outside of doing youth ministry.
See, what you have going against you is you got an undergrad in religion and MDiv.
That's right.
I at least so my logic was I could be a missionary, I could be a teacher, so I'm going to go the practical route and get an education degree so I can do either.
Right.
Versus locking myself into ministry with a religion degree and then having to go get a master's for teaching, which that's a fine route, but I went the logical, keep my options open. So
I tell you what I've done before, and I did love it, and I think it could be a thing, but I just don't have the degree for it, is I taught a couple of classes at Ouachita Baptist when we lived in Arkadelphia. And I had a great time at that. I don't know if the dean thought I did a great job or not, but just that adjunct teaching, I
that's
think
fun.
Teaching Bible is amazing. I love it for kids who have to be there.
I would love that too. I got to teach a freshman class in grad school, and then GA, grad assistant, in a couple of the religion classes. And I do love a good college class or higher ed. I worked in the education department. College is my world if I'm not in elementary. I don't do high school, but once you're expected to be a little more like an adult, or I can at least treat you like you should be.
Right.
That's where I enjoy that.
For sure. Well, all right. Well, I think that's a good conversation for now. Thanks for joining us. This has been First Families,
where we put
families first. We'll see you again next time.
See ya.